How's that? All right?
Yeah.
Fabulous. Right, well, hello everybody. And in terms of talks to the Society, I was thinking just a few minutes ago, my first talk to the Society was in 1994, about when just after I released my first book. There have been a few talks over the years, and it's always been great to talk to such a dedicated mob. Look, Walnuts to World Heritage, how to grow 1 million hectares. Whoops. Yeah. I want to start by acknowledging all these language groups, the Wanneroo, the Darkinjung, the Darug, the Darawal, the Gundungurra and the Wiradjuri. All those groups being the people whose country includes bits of our Great Blue Mountains World Heritage Area. And I'd like to acknowledge any traditional owners from any of those groups who might be here today. So there we are. There's our Greater Blue Mountains World Heritage Area. It comprises 7 national parks and 1 reserve, the Chenollan Caves. It was listed on the World Heritage List on the 29th of November, year 2000, by UNESCO, who do these things, and after nomination by the federal government. I'll mention that in a bit more detail a bit later on. The other important thing to say is that there's a whole bunch of criteria for declaring a World Heritage Area. They include natural values and cultural values. The one in which it was the acceptance was based on is to do with biodiversity, with emphasis on eucalypts. So in May 2001, there was this huge celebration of Govett Sleep. Some of you were there, I'm sure, because there were 2,500 people at Govett Sleep for this ceremony, where Bob Davis, our Environment Minister at the time, gave a speech, as did Robert Hill, the Federal Environment Minister, because you see World Heritage things to do with both the state and the federal government, particularly the federal government, because the federal government's the mob that has to put in the nomination. And a number of other people spoke, including the mayor. So it was quite a big deal. And just hands up those who were there. Yeah, a few there, great. And, whoops, I'll come back to that. So, and a few months later, there were more celebrations. Now, and this is where I'm just going to mention that big banner, or whatever you want to call it, up the back. An event was organised called the Gumtree Songline Walk. It was the brainchild of Wyn Jones, who many of you know, always with a lot of artistic imagination on Wyn's part, because it involved a celebration of World Heritage, whereby a whole bunch of people did bushwalks, starting at far-flung corners of the World Heritage Area, eventually converging at Blue Gum Forest. And there was a ceremony at Blue Gum Forest. Some of the assembled people, there were songs and performances on into the evening on that occasion. It was actually a funny one because it was only a few days after the 9/11 thing, where the Twin Towers got burnt down or sent down, which is why, talking to people, very few people I know actually remember this whole event. And there's 261 handprints on that map with names attached. And I've spoken to some of those people and they don't even remember putting the handprint on it. And I didn't either. But it's just, people have blanked it out. I think it's because basically the world went to shit when the towers were burnt down and everybody forgot about it. I don't know. But anyway, it was a great thing to do at the time, because along the way we didn't just do bushwalks. We catalogued and identified eucalypts as we went. The party I was with was Ian Brown and a handful of others. We walked from Ganguddy, Dun Swamp, to Glen Davis via a circuitous route through the Wallamai, and we positively identified 17 species of eucalypts out of the 100 and something that there are, and a bunch of fauna along the way. And the other thing we did was just a bit of symbolism. So each party carried a little model of a gum tree fruit. This was a Eucalyptus albans or white box. And at each campfire each night, we transfer coals from the previous fires into the campfire and then collect more when we left. So there was a continuous chain of collecting coals through the entirety of the World Heritage Area, and they all went in that campfire at the end. And you can see a whole bunch of those little there's capsules, which is just a great fun thing to do. Only Wyn Jones can come up with things like that. So that big chart up there, banner, that was taken to the various rendezvous points along the way where different parties took over, and also it toured towns around the outside of the World Heritage Area afterwards, and people were invited to put their handprint on it, put their name on it. So that's what that is about, and everybody had forgotten about it till actually a Wiradjuri guy who was at one of the little celebrations at Nunes Plateau got in touch with the Conservation Society a couple of weeks ago and said, "Where's that banner?" And this message came through to me. I said, "Oh, I don't remember a banner." "Oh, yeah, okay." So anyway, it turned out, cut the story, that Wyn Jones didn't think he had it either, but then he found it in his tool shed. So there it is. It's a heritage item because it is a map of the World Heritage Area, and people have put their handprints and names on it as close as possible to the place where they were at the time when they did so. It's a heritage item. If anyone's got any brilliant ideas about where it should be safely kept long term, we'd love to hear from you, because probably Wyn Jones' tool shed isn't ideal long term.
Is there a place at the World Heritage Institute?
I don't know. Okay, so celebrations, and this year we're celebrating 25 years, aren't we? So I just wanted to throw those things in at the start about, how the importance of celebrations and having a bit of fun over these things, especially after many years of hard work that a lot of people did to get to the World Heritage situation. Okay, now, how did the World Heritage Area come about? Well, you could make a number of starting points. You could say, well, it started 20,000 years ago when a lot of First Nations people gathered at some site and said, "Hey, this is a really special place." We know there's a lot of special places for First Nations people across the World Heritage Area. You could say it started when a surveyor, John Deering, looked down into the whole Grace Valley in 1875 and said, "This is amazing. This should be this is a national spectacle, and it should be reserved for an alienation." And it was from alienation, the whole Grace Valley in 1875. And then, you might say, well, it's when Miles Dunphy was born, because he had a lot to do with stuff. But I like to take it back to Blue Gum Forest in 1831. Now, there's a lot of blue gum forests, but for the uninitiated, the Blue Gum Forest is at the junction of the Grace River and Govert's Creek, I should say, down in the heart of the Grace Valley. It's a whole patch of quite impressive Eucalyptus deanii. Henry Dean was the guy who originally described Eucalyptus deanii. He was an amateur botanist. He was also the engineer who was responsible for all the railway line and everything to Nunes, so a man of mixed talents. Anyway, so you've got this wonderful patch of eucalypts, which have taken more than their fair share of hammering from fires over the years, but we won't go there right now. Fortunately, it is starting to look a bit better now. We just don't need any more fires for quite a while. Not serious fires anyway. So there you go. There's a little patch down there on that map, in the middle of that map. Blue Gum Forest was also roughly the site of a camp in 1875 by Eccleston Dufour and so on. But, in 1835, Surveyor General Thomas Mitchell stood at Butterbox Point and did that sketch, and somehow or other he managed to get the rays of the sun pointing down to where Blue Gum Forest is, which I thought was quite interesting. Anyway, 1831, so a party of Sydney bushwalkers, the people from the Sydney Bushwalking Club, went down for a camp, and to enjoy the forest as people did and had been doing for quite a while. The stories vary a bit, but while they were down there, they came across maybe some shopping down by the river, and look, the leader of this party was this guy here, Alan Rigby. He was a photographer, and he took a lot of scenes while they were down there on this particular camp, and he took a leading role in what followed. But basically, they came across these two gentlemen in the forest. This one here, Clary Hungerford. Now, if anyone went to the portrait exhibition in the Blue Mountains Cultural Centre recently, you might have noticed a portrait by one Neville Hungerford. Well, he's the guy in the front of the wheelbarrow, the son of Clary Hungerford. So Clary Hungerford up there, he was basically a battler farmer from up Mount Tomo way, and he and his mate Bert Pearce, as in Pearce's Pass, they had developed the track down Pearce's Pass and started doing things down in the forest, like taking a few cattle down, maybe doing a bit of coal mining at the seam that's on the way down. And in any case, the story goes, and there's a few disagreements about the story even amongst those who were there, but the story goes that they told Alan Rigby and others that they would plan to chop down the trees and grow walnuts. There's a very strong chance that it was always actually a bit of a ruse. It was a made-up story because Clary Hungerford was maybe up for $1. He was a battling farmer. I thought, well, if these people value these places so much, I'll see what I can get out of it. That may well be true, but that's beside the point. So, in any case, Clary Hungerford, we'll go back. So they went back to the Mountain Trails Club initially, and Alan Rigby sort of alerted to the fact that what this guy's threatening to chop down the trees. What are we going to do about it? So Miles Dunphy was there, and he said, "Well, we better start writing some letters," as Miles Dunphy did. Miles Dunphy, being a bushwalker and conservationist of note, he'd been around for a while. He was the man behind a club called the Mountain Trails Club. He wrote letters to the council and to the lands department and so on, and basically that didn't get anywhere. If the guy had a lease of the forest and wanted to chop down the trees, that was his business, basically. So then it came before the Sydney Bushwalkers Club as well. That's Miles Dunphy there, by the way. It came before the Sydney Bushwalkers Club. What are they going to do about it? Shall we have a campaign? Now, one of the other people who was there, a guy called Joe Turner, who I interviewed in his 90s, said, well, actually at this point, Miles Dunphy lost a bit of courage and said, I don't think we're going to win this, it's probably not worth it, or something like this. He had bigger things in mind. But nevertheless, the meeting decided, well, we should have a campaign to save this forest. And so people like Alan Rigby and this woman, Dorothy Laurie, and a number of others all got very keen on starting a committee to save the forest. There was Dunphy got roped in again, and letters were written, that wasn't getting anywhere. So eventually they thought, well, there's got to be some money involved. So in November 1831, they, after exchanging a few letters, they arranged a meeting with Clary Hungerford down in the forest. Now, we're not quite sure when this photo was taken, but it may have been on that day. There's a couple of people on horse, it's probably Clary Hungerford and Bert Pearce, and a couple of the walkers who went down for that meeting. It was a historic meeting. There was a bit of rain about, but this during a fine moment apparently, but they're all, some of the players are gathered there under a flyer. You can see a guy with a scout hat. He was from the scout movement. He was involved as well. But there was also somebody from the Wildlife Preservation Society, but the rest of the committee were bushwalkers, mostly from the Sydney Bushwalking Club. Over on the far right there in the background, that's Clary Hungerford. So this is before they actually started, talking details about it. Now, Clary Hungerford's opening salvo was he wanted £150 to give up his lease. Now, this is the height of the Great Depression. £150 was a great deal of money back then. By the time you take into fact, inflation and all that stuff in the intervening years, not to mention the Great Depression. So, anyway, they beat him down to 130 at this meeting, and he wanted his money fairly promptly. For that, he would surrender his lease. Now, we often see it written that the bushwalkers bought the lease. That's not actually the case. They didn't buy the lease. They paid him to relinquish the lease. The bushwalkers never actually owned it. They couldn't raise 130 quid overnight, but they raised all but £80, and one of them knew this guy called Jim Cleary, who was a reasonably wealthy man. He was head of New South Wales Railways. Perhaps we need him now. But in any case, he was prepared to come up or lend them £80 until they could raise that money to pay him back. A legal document was actually written up. Turns out, he told them years later when they paid him back, I didn't actually expect to get that money back. Anyway, by the way, after he was head of the railways, he became the first chairman of the Australian Broadcasting Commission and was in that role for quite a few years. So, and I should say, a very keen bushwalker and a very erudite man. He wrote some wonderful journals of his walks, most of them haven't been published. Okay, so, and the other thing I should say, on that negotiation day, I mentioned John, or might have been a different day, it's not quite clear, a journalist from the Sydney Morning Herald went down called John Lockley. And he was in his 70s at the time, or getting on that way, and he wrote an article about it in the Sydney Morning Herald. It's got good coverage. In any case, he looked up at this mountain up above, and he must have commented on it, and someone said, "Oh, we'll name that after you." So that's how we get the name Lockley Pylon, and I'm sure most of you have been there. And I just should say too, back in those days, you didn't just walk down from Perry's Lookdown. The track down Perry's Lookdown had not been properly constructed. It was only a rough old route involving some rope ladders and things at the top, and there was no trafficable road out to Perry's anyway. So if you were going camping at Blue Gum, you walk down from Govert's Leap or Evans or down Pearce's Pass. So there you go. So anyway, he was paid his money, and on the 2nd of September 1932, the Lands Department declared that this was all part of the agreement, this was all negotiated. He'd given up his lease. Lands Department turned it into a recreation reserve, not a flora and fauna reserve or a World Heritage Area, a recreation reserve. And most of the committee who were on the campaign that saved it were then appointed on the trust that managed it. The trust that managed it went on for 30 odd years till after Blue Mountains National Park was dedicated in 1959. So it was a long-lasting affair. They did all sorts of things like trying to get, clear trees out of the river to stop what was essentially a natural process. But anyway, that's all right. They were people at their time, their hearts were in good places. The thing is, though, they were so keen on what they'd achieved, these people, that this fed into another thing that happened at the time, and that is the starting of what was known as the Federation of Bushwalking Clubs. It's an organisation that still goes strongly today as called Bushwalking New South Wales. It goes right back essentially to, it was formed in just a short while before the dedication of the forest. And if you read the notes and articles of the time, one of the things that inspired them to do so was the achievement that the people had in saving the forest. Because they realised that through collective action and joining clubs together, and there were 9 clubs initially, that they could move on and encourage the reservation of more areas. So, from that action there with Alan Rigby and all the other walkers, we can trace the steps right through to an organisation that still has a bit of sway today in the Federation of Bushwalking Clubs. But that wasn't the only thing that was happening. Now, I mentioned Miles Dunphy. Now, he had his own thing going. He had a couple of mates in the Mountain Trails Club, and he'd formed a group called the National Parks and Primitive Areas Council. For primitive areas, read wilderness area, right? And so he'd set up this little group of men whose primary aim was to establish more national parks. And this was a bit separate from, well, it was entirely separate from the Federation of Bushwalking Clubs. That's okay, like all these things, there's people who didn't always get on very well or saw the world differently, so he was able to get on with his stuff while other people went on with other things. But among other, perhaps his greatest vision, if you like, was to create a greater Blue Mountains National Park, or as it's called there, the Blue Mountains National Park with primitive areas. Now, this proposal saw the light of day in 1934 in the Katoomba Daily. As a supplement to the Katoomba Daily, there it is. And in fact, I've got the original right here, which is one of my prized possessions, so I'll try not to rip it up. 4 pages of fine print, mostly written by Miles himself, extolling the virtues of what he proposed for this extensive new network of national parks and primitive areas. It's quite a thing. It's got all sorts of inspirational things that you might have come across, like we cannot really live for commerce alone, nor will our civilization be deemed great until we thoroughly recognise the fact that the bushlands and all they naturally contain are gifts of nature, far transcending in value all monetary and commercial considerations. Which is great. And it is full of rhetoric, I have to say. There's a whole piece there written also by the president of the Federation of Bushwalking Clubs, suggesting to people of the Blue Mountains that they join bushwalking clubs and get cracking to create national parks. So it was quite a thing, and I'll mention this again later. But at this point, I'll just pause, because if you read that thing, you won't actually find any mention of biodiversity. Well, it wasn't a thing then, really, was it? What Dunphy was on about was bush, and wilderness as it was traditionally thought of. Okay, so untouched bush as something apart from the cities and all that. Fair enough. He was a man of his time. That was the way he looked at it. The other interesting thing I find is in the 4 pages there's no mention of culture. So he doesn't acknowledge that actually there's even a European culture out through those areas. Things have been going on, and that in fact it was a cultural landscape to some degree. It's something we only talk about more recently, I guess. And he certainly does acknowledge traditional ownership, or the fact that people own the country. And again, just another extend that digression. In 1802, when Francis Borrelia went into the southern Blue Mountains, Gundungurra country, and I've written about this, he actually acknowledged that the people owned country, that the groups he was coming across owned country. And he also acknowledged there were protocols in moving from one country to another. That was very enlightened, and as far as I can find, nobody else had written in those terms. This is in 1802. By the time we get to 1815, when Governor Macquarie followed the new route across the Blue Mountains, people like Judge Barron Field was making statements that basically said that, well, these mountains were just a barrier to the Aboriginal people on both sides. In other words, no one lived there. So, you know, and you know, that was the denial that went on till just a few decades ago. So I just put that in because it's relevant to what I'll be saying later. Anyway, so Dunphy's proposed Greater Blue Mountains Park, whatever you want to call it, didn't actually happen overnight. We had the war, we had other distractions. Federation of Bushwalking Clubs got more concerned about some other areas, including, say, the Snowy Mountains. And into the 50s, nothing much happened in the Blue Mountains until 1959 with the ridge core of the Blue Mountains National Park. In the meantime, though, the National Parks Association formed. And the National Parks Association was formed by bushwalkers, essentially. Leading lights include Tom Moppet, whose daughter married Paddy Pallen's, whose son married Paddy Pallen's daughter. No, other way around. Sorry, yes. You can. Another guy called Alan Strong. Milo Dunphy had a role there as well. That's Miles Dunphy's son. These are people who are coming from the bushwalking side as well, but they just wanted to focus more on, you know, the issue of national parks and not just sort of bushwalker interests as such. And they became engaged with the whole movement towards bushwalks, towards national parks, sorry. I forgot to mention this. There was some almost immediate outcome of Miles' proposal, and this was in 1937. A flora and fauna reserve was created over a large chunk of the southern Blue Mountains between the Cox's River and the Cowmung, essentially. Included the Boyd Plateau, which I'll mention later. And this sounds really good, flora and fauna reserve. Actually, it wasn't worth the paper it was written on. There was no administration of it or anything like that. And it turned out later on that you could go logging in there anyway. So what was the point? Anyway, the 1960s was a time of an awakening of many people on conservation matters, and through the activism of a number of people, we ended up with the National Parks and Wildlife Service in 1967 and a National Parks and Wildlife Act. Blue Mountains National Park, when it was first created in '59, was just created under the Crown Lands Act. So it wasn't administered by National Parks and Wildlife Service because that didn't exist. It had to be recreated when the new act came into force in 1967. So it was a time of quite a lot was happening. Now, National Parks has been obviously integrally involved in the whole movement ever since to World Heritage. Not that it was National Parks' job to advocate for, you know, the creation of a World Heritage area, but nevertheless, obviously, they would support that sort of movement if they thought it was appropriate, and there are certainly a lot of officers within national parks over the years who've done a lot in their own way towards the creation of national parks and World Heritage. But now this scene here, this is in the southern Blue Mountains from a mountain called Mount Borrelia, not far from Canangra Walls, and it's looking over to Mount Colong. I'm sure some of you know of it. There's in the just left of the middle of the picture in the distance is Urandari Peak. Now, it's a party of Sydney bushwalkers again. Happened to be just doing a walk out there near Mount Colong in 1965 or 1966, I forget exactly which. Anyway, they came across what looked like the signs of someone doing some prospecting, a company doing some prospecting. So they made inquiries, and the long and short of it was the Australian Portland Cement Company had plans to start mining limestone out of the hills, or Mount Amor to be precise. That's just this side of Mount Colong there. And needless to say, this got the wind up them, and it's just like blue gum forest, so something's got to be done about this. Come back to this Alan Rigby. Alan Rigby went out on a walking trip to take photographs of that area to support the cause, and died of a heart attack. So Alan Rigby, important because of what he gave his life for, really, but also because of the link there, right through from Blue Gum Forest as an active bushwalking activist. Things got big. Along came the cavalry. Now, this is Miles Dunphy and the pram that he'd been pushed in as a baby all the way out the road to Canangra Walls by his dad, Miles Dunphy. I forget exactly when this was, but in any case, he's only a little lad there. But come 1968, Miles Dunphy called a whole bunch of interested conservation groups together, say, what are we going to do about this threatened mining out at Colong? And the end result of that meeting was that the Colong Committee was formed, which is probably the best thing that ever happened, actually, in terms of a lot of conservation effort in this state. Look, all sorts of things happened. It got very political, and I won't go through all the details, but there was a big lot of community involvement. I remember myself going along to a demo outside the AMP building as a young university student. There was a shareholders meeting inside. Some people bought shares to try and influence the company. It didn't work, but it was a great publicity stunt. This is a shareholding, a copy of a share owned by a mate of mine, Phil Isaacs. Some of you may know. Another mate of mine, Warwick Williams, abseiled off the state office block as part of that publicity. So, a lot was happening. There was a lot of politics. There were a few trade-offs. But at the end of the day, the result was that the mining didn't proceed there, and the initial form of the Canangra Boyd National Park was declared in 1969. That wasn't the end of things there. I mentioned the Flora and Fauna Reserve from 1937. Well, it turned out that forestry thought it'd be a good idea to log the Boyd Plateau. So that's another 7-year battle, principally by the Colong Committee, to stop that happening. Eventually that was stopped, and that area was also incorporated in Canangra Boyd. And so there's a significant thing missing there that should add in 1969 Canangra Boyd National Park. But over the years, a bunch of parks were added, and the years they were added, they all grew. Blue Mountains National Park, if you look at the map of Blue Mountains National Park and Canangra Boyd, they're all sort of intertwined for historical reasons, and they grew over the years as extra bits were added. But essentially that's when the original bits of those parks started, and that was due, most of that was due to a large degree to the Colong Committee, which ultimately became the Colong Foundation and is now called Wilderness Australia. So that's all good. We get an increasing number of parks, and it's looking pretty much like Miles Dunphy's effort, perhaps. And there's this guy, Alex Colley. Now he was a bushwalker from way back. He'd been on the peripherals of the blue gum stuff originally. He became very active in the Colong Foundation. In 1984, according to Keith here, he came up with the idea of World Heritage. Now, World Heritage was a thing that was developed by the UNESCO in 1972, by which an area of outstanding natural and cultural attributes could be declared a World Heritage area. And to be on that list, that World Heritage list, you had to meet at least one of a bunch of particular criteria. In any case, Alex had this idea that the Blue Mountains might satisfy. So Colong Foundation in 1988 engaged this chap, Jeff Mosley, who was at the time he'd been the former director of the Australian Conservation Foundation, and a man of note in other ways, a very knowledgeable man, also a bushwalker, they engaged him to do a study of the international conservation significance. This is the book that resulted next year in 1989. He didn't just do it solo, he had a hand for a number of people of various skill sets. He addressed various values of the Blue Mountains, including the vegetation and the fauna, call that biodiversity if you like, the geology and the landforms, the scenery, and wilderness values. He didn't get into cultural values of any sort, but that's okay. He did a substantial amount of work, and that book stands alone as an interesting read. I don't know if there's any copies still around at all, but in any case, I'm sure a few of you might have one tucked away. Now, this book was launched, well, the campaign was launched with the book by Bob Carr, who was leader of the opposition at the time in 1989. And that essentially started a decade of hard work by a whole bunch of people. It was hard work for a number of reasons. Basically, the state government and the federal government both had to agree, and if they were different political stripes, that was a problem from the start. And then you had experts of different fields who disagreed on whether, for instance, whether the geology was of World Heritage value or not. All this sort of carried on. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of it all, but I do want to acknowledge some of the people who did a lot of the hard work on it over 10 years on that. And of course, there's Keith here, who's here today, and who was director of the Colin Foundation, who were fundamental to the whole exercise. Keith's shaking his head, of course. And you had Bob Davis, who was hooked by the whole idea when he was still a local candidate in 1991. Bob Davis saw it right through to the end, because ultimately became our local member and our Environment Minister. And then when the final submission was written, that was led by Joan Domisel, who I'm sure some of you will know, who is an outstanding heritage, person with an outstanding background in heritage at the international level. If you want to read all the details of what happened in those 10 years and more, this is an excellent book, and I think there's still the odd copy around. Apart from all the text, it's got wonderful photographs by Henry Gold. I recommend that, not just for a coffee table book, but it really reveals all the stuff that went on. Blue Mountains Conservation Society also played a significant role. And I don't know all the names, and I hope I'm not doing a disservice here, but as far as I can understand it, the most significant role was played by this man, Les Coyne, who passed away last year. And there was a little obituary about Les in one of last year's news editions. So just a couple of things that went on. So in 1991, there was a Blue Mountains committee formed to promote it. Council was active in it as well, and various mayors were always behind it. 1993-94, the state and federal governments funded a multidisciplinary assessment that really was to go beyond the thing that Jeff Moseley had done. They actually included a different area for the World Heritage area. It was basically include all the sandstone plateau areas, so that included Moreton National Park down the coast. For whatever reason, all that work didn't go down too well, and so things got on, more politicking and so on. 1997, a reference committee was formed by invitation that included Jeff Moseley, Colin Foundation, the CONSA, Aboriginal groups, and others. But look, finally, the stars aligned. In 1998, Joan Domisel was engaged to actually write a nomination that'd be a World Heritage Area, a suitable nomination that the federal government could submit to UNESCO. the deadline was to write this in 3 months. Now, just before I go on, a few other things were happening, and I want to just emphasise about the importance of community here again. 1992, for instance, Wyn Jones, responsible for the thing I talked about earlier, he did a big exercise where he walked the full length of what was proposed for the World Heritage Area from starting up here at Sandy Hollow up in the Hunter. He walked right through to Mittagong, and a whole lot of bushwalkers joined him for bits and pieces of it. Some sections have quite a crowd of people. Here he's only started out with one person, and that's Rick Jamieson. But by the time they got to Mittagong, there was quite a to-do going on. I'm not sure that all those people walked along the stage, but they joined him there for the conclusion. So what I'm saying is, I guess that there was this community thing behind the whole World Heritage idea, and it was growing. And also in 1992, we had the 60th anniversary of Blue Gum Forest, down in the forest. It was the last time a whole bunch of the old timers from the Blue Gum days, original Blue Gum days, were able to go down. They were taken by helicopter. There's, whoops, run button, there we are. That person there, the lady sitting down there with a piece of paper in her hand, that's Dot Butler. Alan Rigby's wife's over here. I think Dot Butler's probably looking at her speech she was just about to make. But so this was 1962. There've been celebrations most years on the 2nd of, or close to the 2nd of September down there, which is their reservation date. To me, that's all part of celebrating a bigger thing as well. Now, the interesting thing about this particular occasion was that just after this, we formed the Friends of Blue Gum Forest to look at issues of management in the forest and in the valley, and that spawned the Great Grace Gorse Walk, as it was called, which is still running in the guise of the Great Grace Weed Walk. We had our 30th anniversary of that thing last year. And I think so the 90s were a really big time just engaging community, and to me that goes hand in hand with the movement towards the World Heritage thing. And the other thing, I only thought about this morning, the other thing that was happening in the 90s was the whole dam raising debate, first time round. So the Cowmung Committee was formed by Andrew Cox was one of the leading lights there. Again, a lot of bushwalkers and others who were concerned about loss of important country if the dam had been raised to a greater level than the more recent proposals, I should say. And that was a battle that was won. But I remember going to a meeting about that, I don't know when it was, 1994, and there's a lot of people there, a lot of people. So there's a lot of engagement. So, going the wrong way. Oh yes, that's just a press article in the Herald about the Great Grace, about the first Great Grace Gorse Walk to hell and back to save the Grace Valley. That's actually a very important ranger who facilitated the formation of the group, Kath Island, walking across that log. So, the nomination that was prepared in 3 months by Joan Gumsell and a whole heap of scientists was duly submitted, and it argued for World Heritage on the grounds of biodiversity values, for beauty and the scenic values, and cultural values, that's Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal. Geomorphology values weren't argued. Basically, they didn't have enough time, that's my understanding, in 3 months to do it that way. When the World Heritage Area was approved on 29th of November 2000, after a lot more politics again, and those who were involved will tell you about all the shenanigans that went on, because they had to have a vote with all these countries that were represented on the World Heritage Committee of UNESCO, and so you had to get them on side. So obviously there's a lot of lobbying and politics because other areas were involved and so on. I'm not going there because I don't have my head around it. I'm sure you could all talk to
Keith here one day if he wanted to have some more detailed perspectives off the record probably. But in any case, it was approved on the basis of the biodiversity values. The beauty and scenic values and the cultural values didn't get up. Geomorphology wasn't argued in the first place, as I said. Now, the reasons those things didn't get up is essentially, as I understand it, was because in 3 months they weren't able to put together a strong enough case, and also because the powers that be maybe weren't convinced enough anyway, or weren't capable of being persuaded at that time. So where we're at now is to try and address those lakes. Now, it's moving at glacial speed, but Conservation Society and others, many others, have been involved in putting submissions in to recognise these other values, and also to add some of these patches that were alluded to before by Annette, like the Burra Green State Conservation Area, for instance, and now we've got the Gardens of Stone State Conservation Area, areas like that are worthy of being added to the World Heritage Area. All this takes a lot of grunt and a lot of time to happen, but let's hope we get there in the end. And we need to, there we are. How did 1 million hectares come from a bunch of walnuts? Well, what would be walnuts? I just superimposed there Dunphy's vision for a Greater Blue Mountains National Park. That's the heavy line. So we've actually got, well, a heap more than his original vision, which is pretty good. So we've got the northern half of the Wallamai, and we've got all of Yengo, essentially, that he didn't actually see as part of it in the first place. So we're in a pretty good place, really. It's extremely impressive. And how did we get there? Well, I reckon we got there through a lot of community stuff. And yes, there's some really key people along the way, absolutely, and I've mentioned some of their names, and it would never have happened without them, but it would never have happened either without the support of all these other people who are active in various ways. We just put a little voice in here and there, so that people like Bob Devers, for instance, he was swayed, and I know this personally, he was swayed by the fact that people thought this was a good thing and were prepared to put energy into it. And without the politicians on side, it was never going to happen. So, community action, and this is what this society is all about. And it's just so great to hear today, and then talking about all these, ongoing achievements of the society, and I congratulate all those people involved. And we've got to keep on celebrating. Look, so 3 years ago we had the 90th anniversary of Blue Gum. Things have changed a bit of culture now. Here's Chris Tobin doing a welcome to country. 2nd of September, the weekend, it was fouls. Anyone there? It was cold and damp the whole weekend, so we had a couple of hundred people signed up to go, but only a third went because of the weather, fair enough. But there was a gathering at Perry's. Chris Tobin did a welcome and a smoking ceremony before a lot of people walked down, and the weather cleared long enough for us to have a ceremony and a couple of speeches down there in the forest, including by Alan Rigby's son, Jeff Rigby. It was a great weekend. Nice campfire, and the rain more or less held off. It was good. And these celebrations really, to me, are part of, it underpins the forward progress we've got to make. And I'll leave it at that.
Wow. Thank you very much. Firstly, does anyone have any questions for Andy? I'll just bring the microphone to you, and I'll start with Alan.
Yeah, thanks.